Good morning, everybody, and welcome to today's Insight APSAD webinar. My name is Michelle Taylor. I am one of the clinical educators at Insight, the statewide drug and alcohol training and workforce development unit as part of Queensland Health. I'll just run through a couple of housekeeping things before we start today. So you can please do put your comments and questions in the chat section. I'll be monitoring those. Your microphones are all muted, so we won't be able to hear you, but there will be an opportunity at the end of the webinar to have some interaction. I can put any of your questions and thoughts to Irene at the end of today. If you're having any problems, there's a number up there to phone. So you might like to take a note of that. We'll be dropping a version of the PDF version of today's presentation, kindly supplied by Irene. That will become available in the chat, so you'll have access to that. And also, as we do with each of these, we'll be recording. So this will become available shortly afterwards on the Insight website in our webinar library. So I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners and custodians of the land on which our service and events take place. Here, for me, it's Meanjin in Brisbane, and it's the Turrbal and the Yagara Nations peoples. And we respectfully acknowledge the traditional owners and custodians of the lands where you are coming to us and joining in from today. We pay our respects to elders past, present, and emerging. And we extend that respect to all First Nations peoples joining us here today. And we'd also like to recognise those with a lived experience of substance use issues, mental health issues, those who are impacted by suicide, trauma, and all of those who support them alongside them in their recoveries. We wish to recognise their wisdom and that we continue to learn from those groups of people in our work. Thank you. Irene is doing a wonderful job in the background here, advancing her slides. So today, this is the title of our presentation, and that's great. I can see Irene there now. Mothers of Substance, the role of alcohol and other drugs in mothering occupations. So this is what we're going to hear about today. This idea that roles and occupations can change rapidly for women who become pregnant and have children. Occupations meaning those activities of meaning that someone might need to do or want to do in their life. So this talk will explore how alcohol and other drugs might be used by women to support or undermine mothering occupations and identity, and the conflicts of societal expectations and value judgments, and ways that we can support meaningful occupations with women who use substances. Irene Francisco, who is presenting, is an occupational therapist and clinical educator with the Queensland Centre for Mental Health Learning. And Irene has many years of experience in mental health, forensic mental health, counselling, project management, and as she says, volunteering, but a little bit too much in that area. So this webinar today is going to draw on all of that experience of Irene's, as well as her work with Insight in 2021, where she developed e-learning for brief interventions in maternal health, all of which you can see on the Insight website, along with her volunteer work as a counsellor with the Australian Breastfeeding Association. and her previous work as a lactation consultant, and her occupational therapy lens from years of working in mental health. So we welcome you, Irene, and look forward to hearing more about this. I will now turn off my microphone and my video, and I'll see you again at the end.
Thank you so much, Michelle, for that lovely introduction. I'd like to add that my pronouns are she, her. And whilst I'm talking today about mothers and mothering, and I'll be using the term women a lot, I do recognise that both parenting roles and families are very diverse. The roles of mothering have been quite, strongly influential in our society, and that's probably why I have this as my focus, as well as from my own personal experience as a mother. But as Michelle has said, I've got other lenses that I'm drawing from. I also wanted to just pay a little bit of an acknowledgement to my sneaky title here. It sounds awesome, doesn't it? Mothers of Substance. And it's kind of a little bit inspired by Jenny Valentish's book, Women of Substance. If you find it really useful and beneficial to read about lived experience, I really recommend you reading Jenny's book. That she really provides her own lived experience as a woman, not necessarily as a mother, but as a woman, using substances, and she includes a lot of research in her book. So just a little plug there. But let's get into it. What I'll be covering today is a range of things. But before I get into my little spiel about my outline, I'd like you to look at that image I've got there. That is from my Mother's Day card last year from my children. That, they thought it was quite funny. They thought it was quite amusing that, two substances could be fighting about a mother's affection. And this is an aspect of substance use in mothering that is pretty normalised and almost expected. When a mother can't cope, she's going to turn to something. And whether it's the caffeine to keep her awake or the wine to keep her able to manage what's going on, those are things that are almost as important in her affections as her children, at least according to Hallmark. So I found that really, it really did give me an interesting insight. My kids just, they thought it was amusing. But an interesting insight into our societal expectations around mothers and substance use. So I'm going to explore a little bit of that historical and social context of, mothering and mothering expectations, and how that feeds into the view of substance use for mothers. I'll look at some of the current statistics in Australia, and then I'm going to talk about those occupations of motherhood. For those of you who are occupational therapists in the audience, you'll be all over this. For others, I'll be trying to explain to you what it is exactly we're talking about in terms of those occupations, and looking at some of the research and literature that has explored occupations of motherhood, the barriers and facilitators of treatment for people actually seeking support around their alcohol and drug use. We'll have a bit of an analysis at the end, thinking about how we support mothering occupations, and use this in combination when we're thinking about substance use and its occupations as well. And I'll leave you with some resources and further learning at the end. There's been a long history of substance stuff in mothering. Historically, both licit and illicit drugs have been used to cope with mothering. It is a hard job. Yes, it's a hard job. When you look at those images, most of them are kind of very 1960s based. It projects a strong image of what we think mothering should be. The mum should be able to cope with everything and have a smile on her face. She should be able to do the cooking, the cleaning. She should be gentle. She should be loving. And if she's not, we've got a pill for that. So we need to, it's really strongly embedded in society about how do we support mums, and that if mums can't cope, maybe they need something. So we know from the mother's little helper, so benzodiazepines being used in the 60s, that's probably the most common or well-known drug that was used to support mothering. And then, drugs of dependence do become an issue. So to smoking being marketed to mums as, this is the gentle smoke approach. So as well as the idea of, a pint of Guinness to help you with breastfeeding. There's some, there was a bit of a slight evidence base around that during the war and before and during the recession, when access to things like beef and eggs and things high in iron content were scarce. Doctors would actually prescribe a pint of Guinness because it had iron in it. And then there's this social law that sort of just dissipates into the idea that that's okay. It's okay to have some alcohol, or it's okay to have this alcohol whilst you're breastfeeding. Alcohol itself actually suppresses breast milk production. But, there's these ongoing and conflicting ideas. Society has a massive conflicting ideas for mums from a long time ago about what's okay and what's not okay to use to support your mothering or to be able to cope with your mothering roles. In Australia, I did want to mention too, one of the things in this space, like during the 1960s, there was, when you look at suicide rates in Australia, there was this massive peak in the 60s for women. Women's suicide rates tend to stay lower than men's. And then during the 60s, there's a peak for both, but a really incredible peak for women. And most of those were through poisonings. And so when we think about poisonings, that includes overdose on illicit and illicit substances. So access to means was a big issue, I think, in the 60s. And there's lots of social factors that you could go into to try to understand that. But definitely the more prolific access for, helping mums out might have actually been really detrimental in lots of different ways. So in Australia currently, and these stats are from the National Drug Strategy Household Survey from 2019. So take some of them with a potential grain of salt, because it really depends on how people, like how it was collected and how people were able to engage with the survey. So what we do know, though, more readily available information, is that alcohol is definitely, we know that that's a substance that's most prevalent, most used, and possibly most problematic in Australia. When we think about women, 55% of women had consumed alcohol before they knew they were pregnant. And once they did know, there was a decline, which is really, really great. So most Australian women are making an effort to reduce substance use during pregnancy once they know. And that this is, a different picture from what it used to be in the past. There's much a bit greater decline. We know that post-pregnancy, people will tend to go back to some level of use. And we see that 51% of women drank while breastfeeding. We'll talk a little bit about some of that later. Just outlining some of the statistics here. Around 2% of women use an illicit substance, and this is women, not necessarily mothers. So some of our stats we don't have drilled down to that level, but I think it's useful to think broadly about that. And about 2% also had misused prescription analgesics. And you see again a bit of a decline in that once people know they are pregnant, they do reduce their use. This sounds like, oh well, that should just be the case, but it's actually a lot harder to do. For a lot of drugs and alcohol, there can be a big, physiologically it can actually be really tricky to reduce your use. During pregnancy, your metabolism increases. You've got different liver enzymes in place, which actually might make it more difficult, to actually reduce your substance use, and you can have, some more withdrawal and other things. So people thinking about, how we support women to reduce, that's definitely an important aspect of it. And it's not just a matter of saying you're going to do it. I thought this was interesting that 3.4% of couples with dependent children used cocaine. And just also remembering tobacco as a really significant aspect of substance use. And when we're thinking about ongoing potential harm reduction for both mum and children, and tobacco is a really important one. And it is also very hard to give up during pregnancy. And women who smoke tobacco or use illicit substances are less likely to initiate or continue breastfeeding, which is a protective factor as well that often we'll talk about that too, but what often gets suggested is it's safer to not breastfeed, and that may not always be the case. In the popular media, women are presented in different ways when it comes to mothering and substance use. So this large headline here was from a few years ago. I'm at a drugs forum. Here's eye scourge has spread to desperate mothers at home. And there's a little bit of a snippet from that mums are using crystal meth just to get through the day, and women using ice to cope with the kids. Ice use is climbing, so number of children being removed. And then you see these headings where whether a mum's identity is an important part of the fact that she was involved in some sort of drug use, mum will be in the headline. So if a mother has been, if there's any sort of newsworthy thing, she's identified as a mum in the headline. And this happens less with dads. It's just a thing. When you go do a bit of a Google search for stuff, you'll see some stuff that might have father of two in blah blah, but that is less likely to be in the headline, more likely to be in the content. So I think the projection of what is it about being a mum that's so important here, and how does that fit with our identities and our social expectations? Even this one, which seems to be quite, it's useful saying that people are seeing drugs as having a role in supporting when it's really hard to cope. But it's the desperate mothers at home. You have to be really desperate. You have to be a super mum. So there's these expectations that are imposed. And when you think about people wanting to seek help and support, we need to be mindful of that. So let's get into that, understand with that in mind, the current picture of what's going on, our societal expectations, what women are taking on board in terms of their roles and identities. We'll talk a bit about what the literature says in terms of quality of caregiving, and then we'll look at mothering occupations and how that fits. So this little snippet here of this is a large study looking at 24 different studies of a whole bunch of mother-child dyads, so pairing up mother and children, and those who used illicit substances. So they didn't use prescription or other legal substances in these studies. And they analysed, looking at the quality of caregiving. So how did people in these different studies look at caregiving from mother to child? And generally what was found is that maternal sensitivity and child responsiveness, so the mother's ability to respond to the child, were higher in mothers who had not used illicit substances. One of the things that was really interesting with this particular large study is that for those looking at those 24 studies that had factored in for other influences, we weren't just looking at substance, but it also controlled for things like education, socioeconomic status, those sorts of things, the gap was quite decreased. So there was still some level of difference, but it was much less. So it really points out that potentially even our research is biased against mothers who use substances. If we were doing this effectively, we tried to look at all of the things, and we know that women who use substances are more likely to have trauma histories, are more likely to be, from lower socioeconomic backgrounds or to have lower education levels. So to try to figure out, it's because they use substances, well, what else is involved there that is actually impacting on their on their mothering and their parenting? It's only one risk factor of those that can accumulate. And I think none of these studies have looked at adverse childhood experiences as well. So if you try, we know that that's a really strong factor in substance use and also in parenting. So with all that in mind, one of the things that as an occupational therapist, we want to look at mothering occupations. What are the activities that people engage in to maintain this role, to be purposeful in this role as a mother? So we can look at it in a range of different ways, and Dunbar and Roberts looked at identifying what are the influencing factors in occupations of mothering. And one of the things they looked at, so what they found are these sort of three broad areas. You've got the socio-cultural influences, and that's a lot of what we've already been noticing. What are the social expectations of being a mother? What's my ingrained idea of motherhood. And some of that is to do with what society says. And a lot of it is also to be about how you were mothered. So your own mothering experience or being raised in a certain way will definitely influence how you feel mothering should occur. Activities and occupations of mothering, including decision making. And this was interesting, thinking about women who actively decide not to mother the way that they were mothered, or to, that I've got a certain way that, these are the core values and beliefs that I have, and these are important things that I want to see, in my mothering activities. So decision making is part of that. And the range of feelings that occur are really strongly influential factors in how the occupations of motherhood. So being a mother is never free of guilt. Or maybe someone can prove me wrong, I'd love it. But there is so much there that almost immediately evokes guilt in how we feel we're being judged by others. We think about judgment, we think about stigma and judgment in substance use generally, and we add a layer of motherhood on top of that, and we've got lots of feelings of guilt and judgment, lots of stigma. So thinking about how we support mums to not feel judged, to not feel shame for the decisions that they make. But generally, most mums want to be a good mum. This range of feelings, this strong desire, I want to be a good mum, is a really strong factor in how women will choose the occupations or the activities that they engage in with motherhood. That top one there too, under the range of feelings, emotional regulation is a really strong aspect of mothering, that we have to be able to identify our own emotions and regulate those, and then identify and regulate emotions in a little person from when they are very little and very hard to express their own emotion. They're doing it through very vocal and bodily means, and then before they're verbal, and then also when they are verbal. So there's there's a lot in that. There's actually a huge amount of being mindful, understanding what's going on for yourself and for this other person, and being able to regulate yourself so that you can co-regulate your child. This slide is also introducing a bit more in terms of mothering occupations. Sethi did some qualitative research and looked at mothering as a relational role, trying to identify the aspects of motherhood, the roles within the role almost, the functions that these different areas serve. And it's not just going, mothering, it's a role, it's a big thing, but trying to identify what are the things in it. And I find this really a useful concept of thinking of it as a relational role. It's give and take. We, just as, in a relational role as a therapist or as a counsellor, or in your role with your clients, it's relational. You work with someone, you're not just telling them what to do, you're sort of working with them. So parenting is a very relational role. And there are aspects of it in terms of occupation, which, if we delve into it, we can see a lot of minor, like the smaller occupations that build into this. So let's think of caregiver first. This is the role or the function that we often default to. And you'll see, all of that marketing that you saw at the start of the 1960s, it's mum as caregiver, mum doing the cooking and the cleaning and having a smile on her face so that she can change the baby's nappy and all those sorts of things. The caregiver role is almost our societal focus for mothering, but it's only one of the roles. And it's in fact a lot of the practical roles that a lot of other parents or other people in your tribe or community can actually do. So thinking about caregiving, there's cooking, feeding, bathing, dressing. And again, I probably should have said this at the start that, or did I? I can't remember. That I will be focusing a lot on the early mothering aspect. So those early years of mothering, but recognizing that these things do change over time. But there's various aspects, including that one, the daily health observation. You're keeping an eye on how your kid's doing. Are they feeling okay? What do I need to do around that? The nurturer role is a bit different, a bit of a step up there, or different role from the caregiver role. And it includes the showing of affection, use of touch, how we connect emotionally, how do we do things together, how do we play with our children. You can see these roles aren't I'll do this for a bit and then I'll do this. There are overlaps. So, the way in which you change your baby's nappy could be purely caregiver role. I'm just performing the function of changing the nappy, getting it done. Or you can include nurturing in it as well. I'm going to play with my baby and tickle its feet and provide touch and massage whilst I change the nappy. So there's overlaps that can occur here. The educator role, thinking about how the mum teaches her child things like self-care, school support. Then so it's thinking as the child gets older, what that might look like. But we spend a lot of time as mothers teaching life skills, teaching social skills, teaching values and instilling that in our children. The protector role, I think that also kind of gets missed out sometimes, but that it is a strong role where we are not just giving care, but protecting. We are maintaining safety. We can teach our child how to ride a trike, and are we also keep teaching them how to ride a trike away from the road, or not letting them run into things and that sort of thing. So our observation skills, how we reduce harm. So our decision making around protection of our children. And then when you think about substance use, there are various aspects that we can tap into to support that role. And the learner. So I love this model too, because it actually identifies how much is involved as a mother in learning the skills that you're using. So that discovering what works for your children, learning from others. We seek information, whether it's from health professionals, from family, from the internet. And that formal and informal learning that happens, the give and take that happens every day. We learn today that my child doesn't want the blue cup. Okay, we'll find something else. But the learning that takes place across this, so in each and every one of these roles, there'll be some overlap and integration depending on the occupation that the mother is engaging at the time. So I did present this very similar, pretty much same presentation last year to Michelle's OT Substance Uses Occupation Group for Queensland Health Clinicians. And one of those clinicians has gone and done some amazing stuff in developing some resources that are practically useful with clients. So these slides, the next two slides aren't in your PDF, just to let you know. I just slid them in today because Meg presented yesterday. So Meg Schneck from Logan Alcohol and Drug Services at Metro South Health has developed with some students some lovely resources that will help have the conversation with mums about, well, what are your roles and what do you want to work on? So they've got this lovely little checklist that you can see includes mums, thinking about, well, what do I do as a nurturer? What do I do as a caregiver? What do I do as a learner? And really understanding what is my identity as a mother and what do I value? Those things can be really valuable to have that conversation. And I also love the caregiver activity sort card that they've developed as well. So it's got visuals, and I know the quality of the image is not great there, but that looking at those different roles and the different color coding, you can have a conversation and say, are you good at this? Would you like to work on this? What are you not sure about? What's not applicable to you because perhaps someone else does that particular occupation with your child or whatever it might be. So, or the child's not at school or whatever it might be there. So thinking about, how do we have the conversations with people about what are their roles, and then thinking about how does substance use impact on those roles, or how does it play a part in supporting some of those roles? So substance use in and of itself is an occupation, and it does impact in different ways. So what I'm going to do is, so for those of you thinking about, this looks awesome, I will leave it to you to contact. We'll have a chat at the end about getting in contact with Meg, perhaps for those of you who are interested in it, because Meg's very generously said that she would be happy to share these resources, and we'll just have to figure out how we do that most effectively. But I'm going to talk through a couple of different occupations, and we'll think about how substance use plays a part in those. So specific mothering occupations, starting with touch. I'm not sure if many of you have thought about as touch as being an occupation or being an important and purposeful activity that we engage in day to day. But skin to skin touch, we know from birth, can be life-saving. So we know about that. Like every maternity unit in Australia will advocate for skin to skin touch in those first few hours of life to support a baby to co-regulate against a mum or against a caregiver. That's so essential. And we think about it as being essential in those first few hours, and it continues to be essential. And how we do that is going to be important for attachment. So we, I guess, thinking about touch for caregiving versus touch for nurturing, the touch is still important, but there's an additional level of support that goes with nurturing touch. You know, whether it's, you know, stroking your child or giving them a hug, or, you know, and there are various things that you do to support and feel comforted with your child, or also make your child feel comforted. And there's that emotional regulation that goes along with touch. I'm going to do a shout out here to Grace Branjaporn at the Gold Coast, who's done a lot of research in this space, looking at maternal sensory patterns and understanding the impact of touch on that, and also in maternal fetal attachment. So even before birth, how is a mum getting in touch with her baby, her attachment to the baby as it's developing? So that might include her own self-awareness of her body, her own touch, and understanding, you know, where feeling where the baby's at and that sort of thing. That will, mothers who've got greater sensory needs, so I won't go into the whole model of sensory processing for you all, but I guess thinking those who've got lower thresholds for sensory input may find it really hard to handle a lot of touch. The concept of being touched out is something that a lot of people may know what I mean by this, that you might just get to the end of the day of just having little people's hands all over you and just go, oh, that's enough, I'm done. And that is, your sensory threshold is just depleted, and more touch is going to make you feel it's going to be really difficult for you to handle. When we think about substance use and how it impacts on our sensory threshold, I think that's an understanding, well, how much touch do I tolerate? Does substance use, the substances that I'm using, increase my tolerance for touch? Does it actually make me feel more loving and wanting more touch? When we say it helps me to cope, what does that actually look like? And is it impacting on things like how a mum feels that she can engage with her child? So yeah, thinking about those things that do impact on our sensory thresholds. If you work in a space that does have occupational therapists there, have a chat to them. Or if you've got clients that you think, oh, maybe there's something around their sensory processing that I'm not quite getting, maybe they can have an assessment and see what's going on in terms of that. We know that some drugs do either increase your threshold or lower your threshold for sensory input. And that drug use generally does change your sensory needs. And also thinking about the impact of trauma and loss, both on our ability to handle touch and our ability to relate in a tactile way. That, you know, we know that it can shift, and that those pathways that can support loving touch or nurturing touch can be eroded with trauma. So yeah, there's more than just thinking about the various things that do impact on substance use there as well. The next occupation I'd like to talk about is feeding, and again focusing more on the early stages of life. I'd like to just get everyone thinking about, first of all, breastfeeding as protective and breastfeeding as normal for mammals. That's what we do. And so there are lots of real, you know, we talk about benefits, but it's pretty much the biological norm of how human beings are raised is through breastfeeding. There are some strong mechanisms involved in breastfeeding that can really support mothering feelings and attachment. I've got the image here of breastfeeding, the pathways involved. So there's two hormones that are mostly involved in breastfeeding, oxytocin and prolactin. Most of you have heard of oxytocin in various different forms and different ways. So prolactin is your milk making hormone. It's the one that produces the milk. And oxytocin's like really strongly involved in releasing the milk. So the milk's available there, it's being made in the breasts, and your baby gets on and has some sucking action, which stimulates the release of oxytocin. And it's like turning on a tap at that point. It gets pushed out through the milk ducts. And this is what the milk ejection reflex is. Oxytocin, as you may also know, has a lot of roles in terms of feelings of love, feelings of attachment. And it is also a pathway that's strongly eroded in various things, including it can be eroded because of trauma. And we know that there's been research looking at use of substances to reestablish oxytocin pathways where it hasn't been well established for people. And yeah, so thinking, and in terms of feeling good, feeling in a blissed state, oxytocin can play a really important part. Having said that, so yeah, it is calming and it is important for attachment. For mums who have used substances during pregnancy, specific substances particularly can have a syndrome that occurs when baby's born, where the baby can have neonatal abstinence syndrome, which is like a withdrawal. So the mum in utero, so baby in utero has been ingesting substances, and then after birth, there's a depletion of this and they go into a withdrawal state. It can be really distressing. So that withdrawal state in a little baby can be a whole bodily reaction, really difficult, a really horrible cry. It's a really distressing cry, and an uncoordinated sucking reflex. So it may actually be more difficult for mums who have been using substances to breastfeed, and they might need additional support in the early days. But there's some evidence, and there are our guidelines that do tell us about maternal substance use and supporting the neonate. But for some substances, it is safer to continue breastfeeding for a while, at least as much as possible, to almost help the baby have a more measured withdrawal, so not a sudden withdrawal response. And sometimes that's done through express breast milk if it's really difficult to support a mum to attach. But yeah, that co-regulation is really important. I've put the dysphoric milk ejection reflex here as another aspect of thinking about how feeding can shift and change for mums, including for some women, that oxytocin, that strong oxytocin response, rather than calming, can cause a sense of dread or depression, and it's rare, but it's not as rare as I think we consider, because a lot of women will then give up breastfeeding because they're having these strong emotional reactions and they're not sure how to handle it. And I do wonder if there's ways that we can support women to understand, again, with their emotional regulation, what's going on. So do we support women in understanding feeding? Or do we go, because you're using substances, the safest thing for you to do is to formula feed? I think that's the default mechanism in lots of spaces. There are risks in that. Formula feeding is not, not necessarily safer. We know that there are lots of, straight away, there's the risk in terms of not having the same protective elements and antibodies and, a proper nutrition for the baby. But if you've got a mum who's, for instance, have cognitive difficulties because of her substance use, or is just generally disorganized, or has trouble reading the tin and following the instructions, that can be an extra level of risk. Every formula tin is different. The measuring spoons are different. You've got to keep everything sanitized as much as possible. You've got to measure it accurately. And there can be, so we do know that women in these situations may have sicker babies because of not having as good, organizational capacity. So thinking about, instead of the either or, you've got to breastfeed or you've got to formula feed, you've got to, we weigh up risks, don't we, in substance use. We weigh risks up and we try to help with harm reduction as much as possible. And we need to be mindful about that and not making decisions for women, but supporting them in a way that is reducing harm. So think about, well, what are the cognitive processes for harm reduction? In certain substances, it might be about, thinking about, well, what's, do we know the time at which it needs to elapse for that substance to be out of breast milk? For your more lipophilic, fat-loving substances like cannabis, for instance, that's going to take a longer time to come out of breast milk. And you're going to be sort of looking at the information and trying to weigh up, well, what is safer for baby to ingest a little bit of cannabinoids or to not. Like it's not clear cut. It's not clear cut. There's things that we need to be thinking about at the individual level. So looking at the safety of the drug as well as mum's situation. And I'm going to just do a little bit of a plug for the FeedSafe app here. So alcohol use being the most prevalent thing, that in terms of substances and mothering, many women will go back to using alcohol even if they did abstained for their pregnancy. This is an example of a nice, easy harm reduction measure that you can have the app, the FeedSafe app. Mums put in their details of height, weight, etc. And then they, when they start drinking, they tap the thing and then it will tell them how long it will take till there's zero alcohol in their breast milk. Breast milk alcohol content is the same as blood alcohol content. So I actually know someone who's used this app for their teenager when learning to drive. So you can use it for other sources as well, but it's the same. Your body will metabolize and process alcohol out of breast milk at the same rate it does for blood. So that's something that you might be able to share with your clients. The third occupation I wanted to take you through is mental load and decision making. So there's been a lot of talk about mother's mental load or mental load generally in the past few years. And Harkinson and others looked at executive functioning and parental reflective functioning in women with substance use. And what this looks at is that aspect of recognizing and processing their own emotions and their children's emotions. So that's that mentalization. I'm able to keep in mind, what does my, where is my child at emotionally? Where am I at emotionally? And how can I work, to regulate their emotion by regulating mine? That's kind of high level stuff when you think about it, isn't it? That sort of level of functioning. So they did find that it is that mentalization, that parental reflective functioning is low in mothers with substance use disorder. But it is also strongly related to adverse childhood events and experiences and the things that have laid down your neural pathways. So recognizing what the mental load is for mums and where their decision making is at can be really important. What are the cognitive things that they have to take in day to day? How do we support them? And how do they feel judged as a result of some of those decision making? So they might be, like we're talking about, some of those social cultural influences maybe playing a part in their decision making as well. I think about the change of activities in nature occupations as children get older. So young children require, you're much more involved in the practical day-to-day stuff. But as kids get older, some of that gets easier, but then it shifts into other spaces. So what are the decision-making processes around schooling or developing of social skills, etc. And then we add all the other complexities that happen when we work with women in this space. So we know single parenting adds complexity because you've got less people to share the parental load and the caregiving load, as well as you are the source of all of the roles that are in place as being a mother. If you've parenting a child with a disability, so women who, for instance, I've got FASD as an example there, so women who have consumed alcohol during pregnancy, may have a child born with fetal alcohol spectrum disorder. Sometimes this often goes undetected for a long period of time. And how we support mums to handle, it's not just about mothering, there's the aspect of, supporting disability or understanding what's going on for their child. Involvement of child protection is a big deal in terms of women feeling that they can actually seek services or not. The fear of having your child removed is a strong barrier for women. And then, there's the complexity of women who also have children in care and wanting to get children returned to them. Various systems. There are so many systems involved, isn't there? So recognizing that adds complexity in terms of mental load and decision making, and in terms of how you fit in all your mothering occupations. There's a lot of stigma and shame attached to it. I'm going to be, if I go to someone, I'm going to be seen as a bad mum. So just thinking about how the occupations of motherhood can also be a barrier to seeking and receiving treatment. If I have to go and pick up my child at 3 o'clock and that's the only time you've got an appointment, well, I'm not going to turn up to your appointment. If your waiting room doesn't have anything that's suitable for my child to play with or keep occupied with, that's going to make it very hard for me to sit through there when I'm the only parent, the sole caregiver for this child. I'd like you to think a bit about that, about the spaces in which you're working with and how, parent friendly they might be. I remember sitting on the floor at the Alcohol and Other Drug Service that I did a bit of work in, playing. I don't know if any of you guys have got those Hep C cards that have, I can't remember which service put them out, but they're just playing cards and they've got some little facts about Hep C on the back. But that was all I could find to play with 2 children while their parent was receiving some support and counselling, because people don't necessarily want to be talking about their drug use in front of their child. So I think that thinking about those barriers, this is a really lovely article. If you wanted to sort of go more into this space, I think that this article is a really good one to look at those barriers and facilitators to support for mothers with substance use disorders. And it's from 2021, so it's fairly recent. And they looked at a systematic review of a range of studies and identified these different themes in terms of the internal, structural and relational factors that influence mothers seeking treatment and engaging in treatment. And they looked at facilitators and barriers. I'm just going to highlight a couple of them in here. First and foremost, really big takeaway message: motherhood in and of itself as a role is the biggest internal facilitator for people seeking treatment. I want to be a good mum. That is the stuff that's going to help someone feel motivated to change. The desire to be a good mother will help someone seek it, but it also means that they're fearful, that they're fearful of how they're going to be, judged for even saying that I have a substance use issue, that I am using substances in a way that might be damaging to myself and my children. But it is one that we can definitely tap into using motivational interviewing and using other factors, thinking about how motherhood can be supportive and recognizing and supporting that as an important, valuable role. Barriers there that I thought this one, demands of motherhood. So we mentioned that, look, if someone's trying to juggle, if they're trying to make multiple decisions, the fact that they didn't turn up to your appointment may not be because they're non-compliant or they're being difficult. It may just because they're trying to juggle too many things, or their child got sick, or they've been called to the school for something, or whatever it might be. They're trying to manage a whole bunch of stuff. Structural issues that impact on the mothering role as well. Thinking about, well, how are our services parent friendly? A strong facilitator was for services that allowed children to stay with mothers. That was an interesting, and especially when you're thinking about young children. So there are very few services that do mother baby units, but there are some. And that, we're just thinking generally, how do we support people to be able to attend and have some child support or something at least to occupy children. And some of the facilitators there being supportive, trustworthy, non-judgmental providers. This is huge. when I looked at this, I found that this was actually, for some people, this was the reason that they turned up, was because they didn't want to disappoint their counsellor or their worker, because they felt so supported and trusted, and that they wanted to turn up. Okay, so that's something that we can all do really, really well, thinking about how we do this so that we're effectively facilitating mums to be engaged in treatment. So I might give you a bit of an analysis, thinking about what roles and occupations substances perform in mothers' lives. So imagining a mum in her early 20s, she's already had a couple of children taken to care, and she's got a 2 or 3 year old child with her, and she's been told by services, you need to get some drug and alcohol support. And she's told the counsellors, well, I don't know if I want to give up meth, because meth makes me a good mum. I'd like you to just, in your minds, can't put it in the chat because I'm not going to look at it, but think about, well, what are those things that she might be thinking makes her a good mum in terms of meth? What are the roles and the functions that that substance performs for her? These are some that I thought of, and thinking about substances, occupation, and how it fits in terms of mothering occupations. So that function of substance, maybe it makes her more engaging and playful, and so that fits into her nurturer role. I think I did see someone in the chat there, making her alert and work. Yeah, so she's more alert, she's got more energy to cope, and that fits into both her caregiver and her nurturer role potentially. I'm not depressed when I take meth. That's an interesting one, isn't it, to think about, well, how do I function and what is my emotional state? Yeah, so Donna's put in, yeah, she feels like she can handle her life and her kids. Thank you, guys. So thinking about, which roles that relates to, if she's not depressed, if it's actually changing her mental state, it might relate to her caregiver, her educator, or her learner role. She might be learning that my emotional state is improved with this. The withdrawals suck, and I don't deal with them well, and taking meth keeps me steady. So whilst, we think, oh, well, what does that, thinking about learning about emotional regulation can be very tricky for people in different situations. Maybe that's what she's been learning, that this helps me to stay steady and that I'm better this way. I don't like or trust who I am when I'm not on meth. And I guess thinking about that protector role, maybe she feels that she makes better decisions when she is using meth, and that she knows how to take action and that sort of thing. So yeah, thank you guys for your thoughts in the chat as well around that. I'd like you to think about how that fits with some of the people that you work with. What are the roles that they might, and you can explore it with them. What are the functions of the substances that they're using, and how might it fit with their roles in terms of motherhood? I'm aware of time. I did want to just quickly, no, I'll come back to this if we do have time in the chat. So some practical strategies for thinking about enhancing occupation in motherhood. So recognizing emotional regulation skills as a really, really important part of mothering. And we have to regulate our own emotions and then understand and regulate a young person's emotions. And that's pretty full on. And if we can support women to do that effectively, we've got, a bit of a chance for them to improve their parenting or understanding their mothering role, as well as understanding the role that substance use might be playing in it. Think about cognitive functioning skills and what's been impacted by substance use, and how they might also be using substances to alleviate some of that as well. But cognitive functioning is also, and that executive functioning, really important part of mothering. Sensory processing, considering how much is a mum able to tolerate? What's her sensory threshold? And does substances play a part in her regulating her sensory processing? So I really encourage you to talk to occupational therapists or to refer to them for some support in that space. Thinking about harm reduction, when we're talking about harm, not just to the person, but to their children, and thinking openly about it, as in there's not a be all, like one size fits all approach to harm reduction. the risks are different in every situation. We have to have a really thorough understanding of risk and supporting, balancing what can mitigate the risk. And think about what our service and system does in terms of supporting and normalising motherhood, normalising parenthood, and normalising support for families in this situation, so that we don't feel like, you know, people only come to us in situations where they're feeling really scared, they want to get the kids back, or they're scared they're going to lose their kids. Hopefully we can get there before that, but also in those situations, we want them to feel that it's okay. We want to take away the stigma, the fear and the shame related to substance use. Bit of orientation to some of the resources that Michelle mentioned right at the start. Insight's got amazing stuff, I should say, but anyway, they've got some good stuff. So they've got some toolkits which will be really useful for you to delve into if you want to learn more in this space. There's the pregnancy and early life toolkit. There's also a families toolkit. So if you want to think about beyond that early developmental stages, what other supports are there? And there's a healthy lifestyles toolkit that includes some of the following e-learnings. So if you wanted to learn a little bit more about, you know, some of the things that we've been talking about, or dive into a little bit more about maternal health space, alcohol and other drugs, smoking, there's also nutrition, physical activity. These are brief intervention modules, so they talk through brief intervention, but they have lots of resources and links in there as well. And the Be Strong in Pregnancy and Early Life for First Nations Australians is also a brief interventions program that goes through smoking, alcohol use, and nutrition and physical activity, I think. Yeah, so have a go at looking at those. Thank you very much, everyone. That brings me to the end of my presentation. Happy to take your questions. And you do have the references there, which you can't read very well on the screen, but you'll have them in your PowerPoint.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Irene. We can see through the comments and the questions that it's raised a lot of interest from our audience out there. I might just offer one or two in the time that we have left. I'll get through as many as I can, but I think it's someone's asked for any information you might have about breastfeeding when people are on opioid treatment programs, and anything you can offer in that space.
So there's a few different resources that you can go to. So the Australian Breastfeeding Association does have a professionals support area, so you can contact them and ask them, can I access any information around breastfeeding and opiate use? And they do have specific fact sheets and other information available for health professionals, as well as what's available on their website for the general public. There is the maternity, so depending on where you're working, if you're in Queensland, definitely look at the neonatal guidelines around maternal substance use, which is in the references actually. So that can give you what the guidelines are in terms of understanding, what happens when you're using opiates, how long it takes to get out of the breast milk, and what the recommendations are in terms of whether you feed staggering your feeding or timing depending on use. And yes, there's probably two sources.
Very helpful
as well.
Thank you. Look, there was a lot of interest too around taking that research and those models around those occupational roles and the way it was converted to activities and checklists. So I didn't want to proffer anything that wasn't appropriate here. I know you've had a discussion with Meg, and I can also be an interim contact at Insight to perhaps pass on those things. But would you like to just let us know where that sits at the moment?
Yeah, so we haven't, so Meg has sort of given this very generous, I'm happy to share the resources and have them distributed. But at the moment, we're not sure what the mechanism of that will be. But it is wonderful that people do have such a strong interest. So from Meg's presentation yesterday, for those of you in Queensland Health, we are talking about how we fit them onto our mental health, occupational therapy, clinical practice collaborative SharePoint site. But for those of you in other areas, we'll have to talk about how we share or distribute those. So yeah.
Okay. I think there's a couple of things here. That might be a future talk. So I have already put it to Meg that she might like to come along and share more of that broader project, give us the context and help us understand how we could use this and a whole host of other resources there. And if people would like, you can contact myself, or you can use the generic insight at health.qld.gov.au to register your interest in that resource, so that I can let you know if and when it becomes available. If I've also had some interest from OTs around the country who might be interested in connecting. So you're very welcome to get in touch for those purposes. Someone else has asked if you know, is attachment affected by how long someone breastfeeds for? Is that
it's not necessarily dose dependent. It's so complex. Attachment isn't an easy thing to linearly measure. However, I do definitely recommend having a look at Grace Branjaporn, Pam Meredith, Jenny Strong, some of the authors of the recent research looking at maternal attachment and sensory stuff. So that's not specific to breastfeeding, by the way. That's looking generally at touch and stuff like that. No, there's I'm not aware of some sort of magic number that says you have to breastfeed for a certain period of time to have good attachment. There's so many factors involved. So yeah.
Yes, thank you. Look, that funny slide that was earlier, you don't have to put it up again, but that's in hearing Irene speak to this, one of the things I thought about was our criteria for dependence, and how there are many parts to that are occupational in nature. So things such as a person decreasing those meaningful activities that they might have once been involved in, or those roles, and maybe increasing their substance-related occupations. So that was something that I thought about.
Yeah, and someone's just actually asked if you have time to show that. This was just came out of discussion that Michelle and I had yesterday, and I don't mind Michelle's writing here. So but this is from the DSM-5, looking at what are our what are our criteria for someone having a substance use disorder, and looking at what occupations are actually included in there. And so, as Michelle's highlighted here, this is an increased amount of time spent on substance-based occupations. And then the MO is our meaningful occupations. So how much time is spent using, or how much time is spent obtaining, how it's contributing. I find when I looked at this, and I was reflecting on this yesterday and this morning, the DSM seems to have potential gender bias here as well. Anyway, that's my an inability to meet social or professional obligations. It doesn't talk about caring obligations or some of those aspects. How do we define motherhood? Is it a social obligation? Is it a professional obligation? That's a huge thing that's missing, but I think it's such an important thing. What are our roles? What are our occupations that we do? And it's got work, home, school here, but I thought that was interesting that, how do we define the actual, what's in the criteria is really important for us to think about as well.